Majority Floor Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move to recognize the Honorable Ruffy Biazon of the Lone District of Muntinlupa City for his interpellation.
The gentleman from Muntinlupa City is hereby recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the distinguished lady yield to a few questions?
Yes, of course. It's my honor, Mr. Speaker, to yield to the interpellations of the son of a former colleague who was a principal author and sponsor of the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Law of 2010, along with Senator Gordon and this representation.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, it's also an honor and pleasure to engage in an exchange with the colleague of my father who served in the upper chamber.
I am not your father's age, however.
That is very clear, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, this representation spends a lot of time underwater. I go scuba diving at least once a month and have been doing so for many years. And as such, I've been witness to the harm that humans have inflicted on the ocean with the amount of garbage that we see underwater, and the effect of climate change in the form of bleached corals. It now gives us that idea that we should not just be simply compliant to international methods or expectations with regard to upholding the climate. But we should probably be taking the leadership, especially that we are living in a country where we are surrounded by seas, basically an archipelago with 7,107 islands. Does the distinguished lady agree that this kind of leadership is now imperative for the Philippines to take on?
I am so glad, Mr. Speaker, that our good representative from Muntinlupa is speaking of climate leadership. In fact, the Philippines has seized, or at least tried to seize, climate leadership in the global arena because we are one of the founders of the V20. This is a congregation of climate vulnerable nations from 2009. It was in 2009, Mr. Speaker, when this representation, as a second-term senator, went to Maldives to meet with President Nasheed, who is now in exile in the UK, but that's a different political story. He, as you know, was one of the global leaders who conducted his cabinet meeting underwater because he is a diver like yourself. But I wonder now how his cabinet performed, or they happened to all be divers in the Maldives. To make a long story short, it was our discussions and presentation on coming up with a voice for climate vulnerable nations, whether for developing nations like the Philippines, which is an archipelago, or small island states such as the Maldives, and we created the Climate Vulnerable Forum. The CVF has since grown to more than 40 nations, and years later, I believe it was the finance ministers of these climate vulnerable nations that congregated and evolved into the V20 of the finance ministers. So we must not allow ourselves or our voices to be drowned in all the talk, in all the problems on different issues. And the Philippines, as the victim of Haiyan or Yolanda, as the victim of more than 20 typhoons a year, as a vulnerable nation, as you very well said, must seize that leadership opportunity, not just for one time, not just for one organization, but all of the time, and to actually ask for technologies, for climate finance, to be able to help local climate action and help our local governments adapt to changing climate. Yes, my short answer to your question is yes, we should continue our leadership in the climate arena, fighting for nations who are similarly situated, vulnerable nations like the Philippines.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the distinguished lady and I are in agreement that we should take leadership not just in the international forums, but more so in the local practices, as she had mentioned, the local governments. What is the relation of our ocean's health to climate change?
Napakahalaga ng ipaliwanag natin na ang climate change ay hindi lang isang konsepto para sa ating mga sayantipiko o para sa mga eksperto. Climate change is inextricably linked to health. What do I mean? Pag tumaas po ang temperatura ng ating klima, nag-iiba po ang galaw o ang buhay ng ating mga hayop. Vector-borne diseases also become more widespread. The dengue epidemic is linked to the increase in our climate, and this happens in tropical and subtropical climates. For example, as simple as the non-implementation of Ecological Solid Waste Management Law, or RA 9003. We're not even talking about climate yet here. We're simply looking at the non-implementation of a law. When we have large dump sites and we do not segregate our garbage at source, recycle, and compost, this causes, of course, many diseases. Health and sanitation are affected by huge dump sites, garbage dump sites, which have been outlawed since the enactment of this law in January of 2001, and the phase out of open dumps was in year 2005 or 6. How many local governments still have open dumps? How many local governments are actually compliant with RA 9003? Only 25% of all LGUs are following it. Sabi po nila ay hindi to kayang gawin. Kung kaya po ng isang barangay, bakit hindi kaya ng ibang barangay sa 42,000 barangays? So, health and sanitation, the issues of environment and climate, magkakapatid po yan. Pag hindi natin bigyan ng halaga at hindi natin sundin ang mga polisiya, programa ng ating kapaligiran at kalikasan at ng pagbabago ng klima, sigurado po ako na ang mga sakit dulot ng ating pagwalang bahala sa climate change ay lalong dadagsa at lalong makakaapekto sa ating mga kabataan, sa kababaihan. And so, the budgets that we have for rehabilitation, for medicines, for medical assistance, all of this can be used if preventive measures were done, and we could actually reduce all these illnesses only if we implemented our policies and programs. Pag tayo po ay mas aware at mas sumusunod sa mga polisiya ayon sa pagbabago ng klima at ayon sa kalikasan, sigurado po ako ng ating mga sakit ay bababa ang numero. I would like to quote also a United Nations study that oceans absorb about 30% of carbon dioxide emissions and can actually help mitigate the impact of global warming. However, human activities that cause pollution, deplete fisheries, and loss of coastal habitats heavily affect as much as 40% of the world's oceans. What do I mean? Ang ating galaw bilang nilalang ng ating mundo ang siyang nakakasagabal o ang siyang nakakaapekto sa ating mga pang-araw-araw na buhay at kasama na po dyan ang ating healthcare, sanitation. And so, climate change and health, climate change and agriculture, climate change and environment are issues that are inextricably linked and must be discussed and must be addressed together. It is not climate change in isolation of the scientific term in itself.
My distinguished colleague mentioned about the health of oceans impacted by human activity. For example, the destruction or the imbalance of the ecosystem results in the destruction of coral reefs, which serve as the radiators of the ocean, supposed to be regulating the temperature, avoiding warming of our oceans, which lead to stronger typhoons, severe weather. But there are practices by people which cause the imbalance of the ecosystem, such as unsustainable fishing practices, cyanide fishing, blast fishing, bottom trawling, and the like. And as I mentioned earlier, we being an archipelagic country, these waters surrounding us are supposed to be under the care of local governments and national government as well. Would the lady agree with me that this responsibility to prevent these kinds of activities in our waters could be a way for us to manifest our climate leadership?
You're correct. Mr. President, all climate action, just like politics, is local, meaning whichever policies or laws that we enact nationally as lawmakers, even if our districts and our provinces that we represent enact all the local ordinances, but if the local chief executives, if the barangay chairman, if those in coastal communities, for example, don't abide by this, then that would cause a big problem. And so it is important that everybody is climate engaged, that they understand the impact of their actions on the fish catch, on tourism, on the sustainable livelihoods that sustain their lives. Kaya ang issue po ng pagbabago ng klima, it's an every man's issue. Ito po'y issue ng mangingisda at magsasaka. Ito'y issue ng katutubo at issue ng negosyante. Ito'y issue ng politiko at issue ng guro. Issue sa bawat Pilipino, sa bawat nilalang ng mundo. Tama po kayo, being an archipelagic nation, kailangan natin pangalagaan ang ating karagatan, ang ating oceans. Gaya po ng sinabi ko, tayo ay isa sa pinakamataas na polluter ng ating karagatan. In fact, number 1, in terms of microplastics and single-use plastics. Nakakadiri po ang ating karagatan dahil dun tayo nagtatapon ng ating mga duming plastic. If only we segregated waste at source, recycle and compost, and strictly ban single-use plastics, and strictly monitor our throwaway culture, then perhaps, not just as divers, but even our fisher folks would not be as adversely affected as they are now. I appreciate your mentioning the oceans. I would also like to include our lakes, our rivers, our inland bodies of water. They're the source of our very life. Why should we use it as our sewerage? Huwag nating gawing Poso Negro ang ating mga ilog dahil madalas walang sewage, walang wastewater treatment. Tinawag nga ni Pangulo na cesspool ang Boracay. Ilan pa po ang Boracay? How many more Boracays are there in our midst? Perhaps the rivers and lakes and water systems in our districts are similarly situated? Should we wait for this to transform into cesspools before we act? At ang kaganapang ito ay makakaapekto sa mahihirap na galing ang kanilang kinakain sa pang-araw-araw sa mga dulot ng mga water system na ito. So, I'm one with you in protecting our oceans and our water system, and I hope that in our watch, we could make sure and compel each local government to be responsible, not just for its land, but for its water systems within its district or its jurisdiction as well.
Well, Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, definitely within our territorial waters, we should take that leadership. May I ask the thoughts of my distinguished colleague? How about our exclusive economic zones, which is beyond our territorial boundaries, but we have been given sovereign rights over exploitation of the natural resources there? What kind of leadership should we be taking in that part of the ocean?
Well, first our inland waters, as well as waters surrounding us. And all waters within our territory, to the best of our ability, notwithstanding the limited resources of our Coast Guard and our Navy. But admittedly, realizing what in reality actually happens, we are sorely lacking in supervising, in monitoring, much more in caring for our territorial waters. Let us discuss the territorial jurisdiction and the ownership in another venue. Whether it is claimed by another claimant or not, we must take care of it. And that is an inherent right that we have. And perhaps in so doing, that can even assert our right further in claiming the waters in our territory. But if we can't even take care of our waters in our midst, how can we even say that we will care, monitor, supervise, implement our laws in the waters around us? We don't have to look far, Mr. President. Ang mga ilog sa Metro Manila, the dirtiest rivers are found in Luzon. Nakakahiya po, nakakasuklam, hindi natin dapat payagan. Dapat po, I call on the DILG to make all the mayors, the governors, responsible for the water systems in their midst, to make sure that no solid, liquid, or human waste is thrown in our waterways. Yun po, that is a source of the food of our people. Huwag nating gawing cesspool, huwag nating gawing Poso Negro ang ating pinagkukuhanan ng pagkain ng ating mga pamilya na mangingisda.
Mr. Speaker, it has really been a pleasure exchanging with my distinguished colleague. I wish I could engage her in a longer interpellation.
We have 3 years and more, Mr. Speaker.
But there would be other venues. As I close, Mr. Speaker, as agreed earlier, we should be taking a leadership on climate change, not just within our territorial jurisdiction by employing local laws and ordinances, but even in international venues. And as I recognize that our armed forces, our Coast Guard has very limited resources and capabilities, I think in the international arena, the Philippines can still take leadership in calling out international or foreign persons or entities who engage in unsustainable exploitation of oceans around us, not just within our territorial boundaries, but even within our exclusive economic zones. Because if we are to take leadership, we must speak out, especially in the international arena, to call out such kinds of practices, which have an impact not just for us today, but more so in the future. Again, I thank my distinguished colleague for this opportunity. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, may I take this opportunity to thank my esteemed colleague from Muntinlupa. I used to enjoy these discussions as well in my other house with his esteemed father. And I thank you for that.
Thank you, Honorable Representative from the Lone District of Muntinlupa